Before this story pulls you into the white silence of the Old North, do one thing for me. Hit subscribe. If you love frontier mysteries, Arctic survival, and those rare moments where a single act of mercy reshapes destiny, this channel is made for you. Subscribe now, because what this trapper does with his last fire will bring 200 hunters to his door by morning. The wind came in hard sheets, not like ordinary weather, but like something alive. Blow snow that erased the world one breath at a time. Out here near the Arctic tree line, winter didn't just surround you. It decided whether you existed. His name was Ewan Mercer, though most men who still remembered him called him Mercer and left it at that. Names felt too soft for a country that could crack bone with cold. He'd been wintering alone for weeks in a small log cabin, pinned between black spruce and open tundra, a place where the last trees grew twisted and stubborn before the land gave up and became nothing but snow, rock, and sky. In the late 1800s, the North was full of men like him, trappers who followed fur lines and rumors, who trusted their hands more than any government map. But the old Inuit roots were older than paper, older than the trading posts, older than the Kalunat stories that said this land was empty before strangers came and found it. Mercer knew enough to keep his distance from camps, to never take more than he needed, to avoid offending people whose knowledge of the land was not theory but inheritance. That afternoon, he was checking his deadfalls and fox sets along a ridge where the wind carved the snow into hard waves. The sky had the pale color of bone. His eyelashes were frosted. His scarf had become a stiff band of ice. He moved with the careful rhythm of someone who'd learned the North's rules. Do not sweat, do not rush, do not fall. Then he heard it, thin at first, almost swallowed by the gale. Not a wolf, not a fox, not the creak of tree limbs in wind, a sound that didn't belong in a place this empty. Mercer stopped so suddenly his snowshoes sank. He listened again, turning his head like an animal. The sound came once more, closer now. Half cough, half cry, the kind of noise a throat makes when it has run out of warmth. He followed it off the ridge into a shallow dip where wind had piled snow against a boulder field. The cold here felt heavier, as if it sat on his shoulders. He pushed through swirling white until he saw something dark against the snow, something too still. A person. At first he thought it was a trick of stormlight. The North played cruel games with the eyes. But then the dark shape moved, just barely, like a seal breaking water. A hand lifted and fell again, fingers curled with no strength left to close. She was lying on her side in a drift, partly sheltered by rocks, yet still losing her battle. Her clothing wasn't like the wool and canvas most outsiders wore. It was layered, carefully made, built for wind. But the layers were torn and stiff with ice, and the frost on her cheeks looked like pale paint. Her hair, black as wet stone, had frozen into strands that clung to her face. Mercer crouched at a distance first, instincts sharp. The old rule on the frontier was simple: anything that looks helpless might still kill you. But this wasn't a trap. This was someone who had walked too far, been chased too long, or been forced into weather no human should be in. Her eyes opened, and they fixed on him with a strange clarity. Dark, alert, not pleading. Even half frozen, she watched him the way hunters watch a crossing, measuring, deciding. Mercer saw her lips move. No sound came out. He understood something then that made his stomach tighten. In the North, speech isn't the first thing you lose. Heat is. Fine motor control. Judgment. And then, if the cold keeps winning, the body does something treacherous. It offers you a sense of comfort right before it takes everything. That false calm, that surrender. She was close. He reached into his coat and felt the small tin match case there, light as a guilty secret. He'd been rationing. Every night he fed his stove with split spruce and careful patience, stretching a little fuel into a long season. But the matches were the real wealth. A man could cut wood with a knife. He could build a windbreak with his hands. But without flame, his cabin was just a wooden coffin. He had counted the sticks the night before. 5 left. Not 5 boxes, 5 matches. And in his stove, buried under ash, there was one small treasure he'd been guarding like a miser. A coal that still held a dull red heart if you knew how to wake it. Fire wasn't a comfort up here. It was the line between tomorrow and never again. The Inuit knew that better than any outsider, how a quillic steady flame could hold a home together in the long dark, how sharing heat was sharing life. Mercer had seen it once at a distance years ago. The soft light, the calm hands, the way a single flame could turn winter from an enemy into a guest. He didn't know their words well, but he knew one thing that mattered. Fire was not owned by one person the way fur and bullets were. Fire was a responsibility. Still, responsibility didn't make his fingers move. Fear did, because he knew what would happen if he turned away. He would walk back to his cabin, close the door, feed his stove, and live. And somewhere behind him, the wind would finish its work. By morning, the drift would be smooth again, as if no one had ever been there. Mercer looked at her one more time. She didn't beg. She didn't even blink much. She simply watched him, and in that gaze was something worse than anger. Expectation, as if she already knew what kind of man he was going to be. He swallowed, feeling the cold like sand in his throat, and made his choice. "All right," he muttered to the wind, to himself, to whatever listened out here. "All right, one flame." He slid his arms under her carefully. She was lighter than she looked, which frightened him. Weight fell away fast when the North started collecting its debt. She tensed, instinct flaring, and her hand twitched toward her belt. There was something there, tucked tight, maybe a small knife. But the movement died before it finished. Not enough strength. "It's me or the snow," Mercer said softly, though he wasn't sure she understood. "That's the bargain." He hauled her up and turned toward home. The storm slapped his face, tried to steal his balance. He leaned into it, snowshoes scraping hard pack, his breath burning. Her head rested against his shoulder, and he felt how cold she was through his coat, cold enough that it seemed impossible she was still alive. As he walked, he noticed something else, a thin strip of cord tied around her wrist, and beneath it a small pouch, sealed and close to the skin, as if it mattered more than food. A charm, a family thing, or tinder kept dry against the body. Inuit people didn't carry useless objects in winter. Everything had purpose. The cabin appeared at last through the white, low, dark, half-buried, smoke barely threading from the pipe. Mercer kicked the door open, carried her inside, and the warmth that hit him felt like stepping into another life. He laid her near the stove, not too close. You didn't shock the body with heat. You coaxed it back. He stripped off his mittens, hands clumsy, and dug into the stove's ash with a bent spoon until he found it. The coal, faintly glowing, stubbornly alive. He held it like a fragile sin. Then he opened his match case and stared at what was left. 5. Mercer took one match and set it aside, as if making a promise to himself. He took another and hesitated, listening to the wind batter his roof, listening to the shallow, uneven breath of the woman on his floor. He struck the match. The flare was sudden and beautiful, a tiny sun in a dark room. He used it to wake the coal, feeding it with shaved spruce, building flame the way you build a shelter, carefully, patiently, with respect. The fire caught, brightened, and the stove began to hum with heat. The woman's eyelids fluttered. Her lips moved again. This time, a whisper scraped out. One word he didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. Not thanks. A warning. Mercer leaned closer, heart thumping in the quiet, and for the first time he realized the storm outside wasn't the only thing hunting tonight. The fire took, but it didn't roar the way Mercer wanted. It breathed, small, cautious, as if even flame understood how easy it was to die in this country. He kept the stove door cracked just enough to coax air into the coals, then turned back to the woman on his floor. In the cabin's dim light, she looked even worse than she had in the storm. Frost clung to her lashes in pale spikes. The skin along her cheekbones was wind-burned raw, and her lips were split in neat red lines that had frozen and cracked again. Her hands were the first thing he noticed, fingers swollen and mottled, the knuckles whitened, the nails rimmed with ice. Not the hands of someone who stayed close to a post stove. These were hands that had fought the land bare-handed. Mercer pulled his own mittens off and hovered his palms near hers, not touching at first, just letting warmth drift. You didn't grab a half-frozen hand and knead it back to life. Men who did that ended up snapping skin like old bark. He poured a little water into his tin cup and set it near the stove until it was only lukewarm, then brought it to her and guided her hands into it. Her fingers twitched, pain or the faint return of feeling. She didn't cry out. She didn't even flinch the way most people did. She simply stared at the stove as if the fire was a living thing she didn't fully trust. He had seen that look before in the north. People who survived the long dark learned to respect warmth, not chase it like a drunk chases whiskey. Too much, too fast, and your body betrayed you. Mercer crouched beside her. "You're safe," he said, and immediately hated the lie. Safe was a word for towns with doors and laws. This cabin was a splinter of wood in an ocean of winter. Her eyes shifted to him, sharp, awake in a way her body wasn't. She tried to speak again. Nothing came out. Only a breath that rasped at the back of her throat like sand on stone. She swallowed and tried once more, but the effort drained her. Her eyes pinched, then steadied. No panic, just a hard patience. "The cold took your voice," Mercer murmured, more to himself than to her. "For now." He reached for a folded blanket and draped it over her shoulders, leaving her arms free. The moment the wool touched her, she stiffened. Not fear of the blanket, fear of being covered, of being trapped, of not being able to move fast. It was the reflex of someone who had learned that being pinned was how people disappeared. Mercer raised both hands slowly, palms open. "All right, no surprises." She watched him for another long moment, then her gaze dropped to her wrist. That was when he noticed the cord, a thin strip of braided hide tied snugly as if it had been retied in haste. And under it, pressed close to her skin, was a small pouch, dark leather, stitched tight. The seams done so cleanly they looked almost decorative, but nothing about it felt like decoration. It looked like a person's last certainty. Mercer didn't touch it. He didn't ask. He just nodded toward it. "That yours?" She blinked once. Then, with slow effort, she lifted the pouch with 2 fingers and held it toward him, not offering, not surrendering, just showing. Her hand trembled. She held it like a warning and a request at the same time. Mercer leaned closer. The pouch wasn't heavy, but it had shape, something rigid inside, not coin or meat. He caught a faint smell too, not of smoke or fur, but something clean and sharp, like dried moss. He remembered old conversations at a trading post far south, the few times he'd listened instead of drinking. Inuit women, one trader had said, carried their world in small things. A needle case, sinew thread, tools to repair what kept the family alive. Another man had laughed and called it superstition. Mercer had not laughed. "Needle kit," he guessed. She didn't react to the English words, but her eyes softened by the smallest degree, and Mercer understood that he was close enough. He set the pouch back against her chest, careful, and she relaxed a fraction, as if he'd passed a test he didn't know he was taking. The stove gave a quiet metallic tick as it warmed. Mercer fed it another sliver of spruce, then moved to his shelf where he kept his supplies, a little flour, a sack of dried fish, a block of salt, rendered fat in a tin. He hesitated over the fat. He'd saved it for the end of the season. A man could chew dried meat in cold, but fat was heat, and heat was life. He glanced at the woman. Her eyes were fixed on the flame again, but not the way a starving person stares at food. There was memory in her gaze, as if she was seeing something that belonged to her world, not his. Mercer followed her eyes and realized she wasn't staring at the stove's iron belly. She was staring at the idea of fire itself, steady, tended, protected. He swallowed. "You know a different kind of fire, don't you?" She didn't answer. She couldn't, but she shifted slightly and pointed, not to the stove, but to the small clear space on the floor between them where the light fell. Mercer frowned. "You want something here?" She reached for her pouch with stiff fingers. The movement was slow, painful, but determined. Mercer stayed still, letting her choose the pace. She opened it with a careful tug and drew out a small bundle wrapped in hide. She unrolled it to reveal a few items: a thin strip of dried moss-like material, a piece of worked stone or bone, and something that looked like a wick, fibrous, pale, and delicate. Mercer's breath caught. "Arctic cotton," he whispered, remembering a word someone had said once. Plants that grew low and soft, gathered and dried, used to carry flame. The Inuit didn't just make fire, they kept it like a heartbeat. She angled the bundle toward him, and he understood. She wanted a lamp, not a stove. A lamp. Something small, controlled, dependable. Something that didn't roar and smoke and eat wood like a hungry animal. Something you could shield with your body if the wind found a crack. Mercer looked around his cabin. He had no soapstone bowl, no carved lamp. He had iron and tin and rough tools, but he did have a shallow pan, an old dented baking tray, and he had fat. He set the tray on the floor and placed a lump of fat into it, then watched her face. She nodded once, approving the choice. He warmed the fat near the stove until it softened, then pressed it flat, making a shallow pool. The woman guided him with small gestures. This much, not that much. A place for the wick. The wick's edge angled toward the flame, not buried in it. She moved like someone who had done this 1,000 times, hands that knew the difference between a lamp that soothed and a lamp that smoked the air to death. Mercer reached for his match case. The sight of it made his stomach tighten again. He could feel the weight of those remaining matches as if each one was a year of his life. He had already spent one to wake the stove. The smart thing was to hoard what was left. The smart thing was to tell himself the stove was enough. But the woman's eyes were on the little lamp he'd made, and in them was something he hadn't expected. Not desperation, expectation again. A quiet certainty that in her world, when you have flame, you share it with the person who's freezing beside you. Not because you're soft, but because you understand the math of survival. Mercer exhaled slowly. "All right," he said, and his voice sounded smaller than the storm had. "One more." He struck a second match. The flame hissed to life, bright and clean. He brought it to the wick, and for a second nothing happened. Then the fibrous edge caught, and a tiny, steady light rose from the tray, soft, controlled, alive. Not the roaring belly of a stove, something gentler, something that felt older. The woman's shoulders eased. Her eyes closed briefly, and when they opened again they shone with wetness that wasn't from melting frost. She reached out, not quite touching the lamp, as if acknowledging it. A Kulik reborn in a Kalunat cabin. Mercer didn't know the prayers, if there were any, but he felt the moment anyway, the way a small flame could make a room feel inhabited again. The north outside didn't change, but inside the cabin, something shifted. Not peace, not yet, but connection. She tried to speak, failed, then lifted her hand and pressed 2 fingers lightly to her chest. A name, a beginning. Mercer leaned in. "What?" Her lips formed a sound without voice. He had to read it from her mouth. Kiona, Mercer repeated softly, and the name settled into the air like a promise. He pointed to himself. "Mercer. Ewan." Kiona's gaze flicked to the window then, sharp, sudden. Her body went still under the blanket as if a string had tightened inside her spine. She stared at the glass, listening. Mercer listened too, holding his breath. At first there was only wind. Then, faint beneath it, so faint he would have missed it if the room hadn't gone so quiet, came the distant yelp of a dog. Not close, not yet, but coming. The yelp came again, sharper this time, then cut off as if swallowed by the wind. Mercer stood perfectly still, listening with the kind of attention a man gives a rifle sight. The stove ticked softly. The little lamp's flame held steady, a pale eye in the room. Kiona's gaze stayed locked on the window. Her breathing changed, still shallow, but more controlled now, like she was forcing herself to stay awake. She pushed up on one elbow, pain flashing across her face, and for the first time Mercer saw something behind the frost and exhaustion. Fury. Not wild panic. Something colder. He crossed to the window and wiped a circle clear with his sleeve. Outside was a blur of white and moving shadow. Below, snow raced across the ground like smoke. At first he saw nothing but wind. Then, through the storm, a dark shape passed between the spruce trunks, low and quick. A dog. Not a lone wolf dog either, not the half-feral kind that wandered near camps. This one moved with purpose, nose down, tail straight, as if it belonged to someone who expected it to work. Mercer's mouth went dry. In this country, dogs meant people, and people rarely came by accident. He turned back and found Kiona watching him, her eyes asking a question she couldn't voice. Mercer crouched beside her, keeping his tone calm. "How many?" he asked, though he knew she might not understand. Kiona swallowed, working her throat like it hurt to move. Then she forced sound out, thin, scraped raw, as if her voice had to claw its way through ice. "Kalu," she began, coughed, then tried again. "Kalunat." The word landed in the cabin like a stone. Mercer knew that one. He'd heard it spoken at trading posts and along the river routes, sometimes flat and neutral, sometimes edged with contempt, depending on the speaker. Outsider. White man. Stranger. "Kalunat," Mercer repeated quietly. White men. Kiona nodded once, a small, violent motion. She tried to sit up higher and winced, hand tightening around her pouch as if it kept her anchored. Her lips moved again. "Men," she whispered. Then she pointed toward the window and made a pulling motion with her hand like yanking something away. "Dogs," she rasped. The word came out clearer than the others, maybe because it was simpler, maybe because she'd had to say it before. Mercer felt a coldness that had nothing to do with weather. "They took dogs?" Kiona shook her head sharply. Then she pressed her fingers to her own wrist, miming a grip, and dragged her hand across the floor as if someone had hauled her. Her eyes narrowed and her mouth shaped another word. "Taken," she said. It wasn't perfect English, but it didn't need to be. Mercer stared at her, piecing it together. Kalunat men, dogs, taken. She wasn't lost. She wasn't just caught in a storm. She had been running from people who used dogs to track, to chase, to surround. Men who didn't belong to her world and didn't respect the rules that kept the North from turning into a slaughterhouse. His mind jumped to the worst stories that drifted up every few years like debris in spring flood. Rogue crews wintering over, half drunk on profit and isolation. Whalers who thought they owned the coast because their ships had names painted on the sides. Traders who paid in cheap liquor and took whatever they wanted afterward. Men who treated Inuit camps like convenient labor and women like spoil. Most of those stories were exaggerated, Mercer had told himself. Frontier talk. But he'd also seen enough to know the North did strange things to men who arrived already hungry for power. There was too much emptiness up here, too little consequence. He looked at Kiona's torn clothing again, the frost damage on her hands, the way she had clutched her pouch like a lifeline, and he remembered her eyes when he found her, alert, proud, unbroken. The kind of person who didn't collapse unless something forced her to. "What did they do?" Mercer asked softly. Kiona's jaw tightened. She said a string of words Mercer didn't know. Inuktitut, clipped and urgent, the sounds shaped like wind through stones. Then she stopped, breathing hard, and tried again in English, building the sentence piece by piece like a man stacking logs. "Camp. South," she whispered. "Men. Come. Night." She lifted 2 fingers, then 3. Numbers, maybe, or just many. Her eyes flashed. "They take," she said again, and this time the word carried more weight. Not just taken, stolen, seized, claimed. Mercer felt his hands curl into fists without him deciding. They took people. Kiona didn't nod, didn't need to. She only closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, there was moisture at the corners that the cold had not made. The lamp's tiny flame reflected there, trembling. "Why you here?" Mercer asked. "Why not go? Your people." Kiona's gaze flicked to the window again. She tapped the pouch at her chest, then pointed to Mercer's stove. Then made a circle with her hand as if drawing a ring around the cabin. Mercer understood enough to feel sick. She had come here because she had no other safe choice. The storm was bad, yes, but worse was being found on open ground by men with dogs. Helping her had not ended the danger. It had moved it into his cabin. He stood and walked to the door, listening. The wind hit the logs like fists. Somewhere outside, faint as a memory, came the jingle of something metallic, harness rings perhaps, or a bell on a lead dog. Then another yelp, closer now, answered by a second. Mercer's cabin was not hidden the way he liked to pretend it was. Smoke left tracks in the sky. Snowshoe prints left stories in the drifts. Even the faint smell of cooked fat could travel in cold air like a rumor. He turned back to Kiona. "If they're tracking you," he said, "they'll track you here." Kiona's eyes held his. She lifted one cracked hand and made a small motion, palm down, as if pressing something into place. Settle. Wait. Think. Mercer almost laughed at the irony. An outsider trapper trying to live like a ghost, now taking instruction from a half-frozen woman who had clearly fought harder battles than cold. "The rule of the North," Mercer murmured, more to the stove than to her. "Nothing is free." He looked at the match case on his shelf. He looked at the lamp, that Inuit-style flame he had made from his own scarcity. He looked at Kiona, wrapped in his blanket, still gripping her pouch like it was the last piece of her old life. He realized he had already paid. Not in fur or bullets or money. Those were easy. He had paid with a decision, the kind of decision that could not be taken back. Mercer moved quickly, mind switching into the same mode he used when a blizzard threatened to bury his cabin overnight. He banked the stove to reduce smoke. He swept the floor near the door to erase the darker wet marks his boots had left. He took a pan of snow and rubbed it along the threshold to kill the scent. It was crude, but scent mattered to dogs more than it did to men. Kiona watched him with a strange calm, as if she knew the shape of what was coming and had already made her peace with it. Mercer grabbed his rifle from the wall and checked the chamber. 2 shots, maybe 3 if he was careful. The North did not reward bravado. One bad decision with a gun and you spent the rest of winter bleeding. He crouched beside Kiona again. "Can you walk?" he asked. Kiona tried to move her legs. Her face tightened, but she didn't cry out. She shook her head once, no, then pointed toward the back of the cabin where Mercer kept a trapdoor leading to a small storage crawl, half dug into the ground. Her eyes asked him something now, almost pleading without losing pride. "Hide me." Mercer hesitated only a second. If he hid her, he was choosing a side. If he handed her over, he would live, maybe. But he would live with the knowledge that his fire had revived her, only to deliver her to whoever chased her. That wasn't survival. That was cowardice dressed as practicality. He opened the trapdoor and motioned her toward it. She pushed herself up, gritting through pain, and Mercer slid an arm under her shoulders to help. Her body was still cold, but not dead cold anymore. Alive enough to fight, alive enough to hate. As he eased her down into the crawl space, her fingers caught his sleeve. She looked up at him, eyes fierce even in weakness, and forced out 2 more words. "Not trust," she rasped, then corrected herself, jaw trembling. "Do not trust." "Trust who?" Mercer whispered. Kiona's gaze snapped toward the door, and in that moment, over the wind and the stove's quiet hum, Mercer heard it, clearer now, unmistakable. A human voice outside, not Inuit. Not close to camp talk he'd heard on river routes. English, rough and loud, carried by men who believed the world existed to hear them. "Ho, cabin! You in there? Ho, cabin! You in there?" The voice came again, closer, louder, shaped by the kind of confidence that only grows in men who've never been truly afraid of consequences. Mercer didn't answer right away. Silence was a tool in the North, same as a knife. He held still, listening. Outside, the wind scraped across the logs like nails. Beneath it, faint but steady, came the soft huffing of dogs and the creak of leather harness under strain. A dog team. Not one animal wandering, not a hunter passing by. A crew. In the crawl space behind him, Kiona shifted. The movement was small but sharp, like a cornered animal tightening its muscles. Mercer heard the faintest intake of breath, and then nothing, as if she had forced her lungs to stop making sound. He lifted his lantern from the hook by the door and turned the flame down low. Too much light in a window was an invitation. He moved toward the back wall, where a narrow shuttered opening looked out onto the lee side of the cabin. He cracked it just enough to see. The night had thickened into a white blur. Snow moved sideways in ghost sheets, but lantern light reached farther than a man expected in cold air, and in that pale cone Mercer caught shapes that didn't belong. A long, low line of wood and bone, curved runners half buried in drift. A sled. Not the heavy freight kind the posts used, but a narrow Arctic sled built to ride over hard windpack. A komatik, he thought, remembering the word from men who'd lived farther north than he had. It sat off to one side as if whoever had arrived didn't care if it was exposed. That meant they expected to stay only long enough to take what they came for. The dogs were there too, half hidden. Dark bodies hunched against the wind, tails curled tight. They weren't barking much now. They were listening, waiting, working. Mercer shifted the lantern and looked down at the snow. Tracks. Not just a few prints, many. Stamped hard, crossing and recrossing like men pacing in impatience. Boot prints, not the soft, rounded impressions of cameek or moccasins. The tread marks were sharp-edged and deep. Heavy men, heavy clothes carrying weight. And then he saw the line. It ran from the direction of the ridge straight toward his cabin, cutting through the snow like a scar. Something had been dragged. Not a log, not a deer. The groove was too straight, too deliberate, and it dipped where the weight had caught on drift. In places the line widened, as if whatever it was had rolled once, then been yanked again. Mercer's stomach tightened as he imagined a body hauled across hard snow, ribs bumping stone, hair catching ice. He pulled the shutter closed and turned away from the window. The voice outside returned, now with an edge of irritation. "We can see your smoke, friend. No sense pretending you ain't there." Mercer's mind raced. There were rules the North taught you fast. Don't open your door to men you wouldn't share your last fire with, and don't let strangers stand close enough to your threshold to rush you. A cabin could protect you, if you treated it like a fort and not a home. He stepped to the door but kept his body to the side, out of line with the crack. He lifted the rifle, not pointing it, just holding it where it could be raised in a blink. "Keep back from the door," he called, voice steady. "Wind carries sound, I hear you fine." A pause, then a chuckle. "Oh, look at that. Nervous, ain't he?" Another voice, lower. "He's got a gun. Don't get cute." Mercer listened for footsteps shifting, for the scrape of boots in snow. He heard the faint jingle of harness rings again, and a dog's impatient whine. In the crawl space, Kiona made a sound. So small it almost wasn't there. A breath forced through teeth. Mercer didn't look back, but he felt her fear like a presence in the room. It wasn't fear of him. It wasn't even fear of death. It was fear of what happened after men like these decided a person was a thing. He crouched near the trapdoor and whispered, barely moving his lips, "Stay quiet." Kiona answered with a faint rustle like cloth shifting, and then the softest whisper of Inuktitut, one word repeated, as if naming the thing that hunted her. Mercer didn't understand it, but he understood the tone. That word had claws. He stood again and forced himself to breathe slow. Panic used up warmth and judgment. Outside, the men were testing him the way wolves test a muskox, probing, looking for a weak spot, waiting for the moment the herd breaks. The first man spoke again, closer now. "We're not here for trouble. We're looking for a lost piece of property." Property. Mercer felt something cold and clean move through him, sharper than anger. "I don't deal in stolen things," Mercer replied. "Oh?" the man said, amused. "Then you won't mind opening up so we can have a look around. Might be she stumbled in here. Might be you got unlucky." Mercer didn't answer. Silence again. The man sighed theatrically. "All right then. We'll do it the hard way." Mercer heard boots crunching closer. Instinct snapped his body tight. He shifted his stance, planting his feet so he could drive the door shut if it burst inward. He reached for the latch cord and pulled it taut, not locking it. Locks could be broken, but bracing it. Then, suddenly, the crunching stopped. A different sound replaced it, soft, rhythmic, coming from farther out. A line of movement in the snow, dogs being turned. Harness tightened, not men moving in for the door, but men repositioning. They were spreading. Mercer's throat tightened. 4 men at a door was trouble. A crew that began to circle a cabin was something worse. That meant they believed they had